Welcome to this account of one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, I invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the precise time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know what locations and what hours of the day or night these documented accounts manage to reach. Back in the winter of 1912, the Springfield Republican newspaper published a brief notice concerning a family disturbance down in Taney County, situated deep within the Ozark Mountains. The article, which barely filled 3 paragraphs, mentioned that local authorities had been summoned to look into the disappearance of a woman by the name of Eliza Whitlock from her remote homestead near the White River. According to the newspaper, her husband, Thomas Whitlock, claimed she had departed voluntarily following a domestic quarrel. The piece wrapped up by stating that no additional investigation was considered necessary at that moment in time. What the paper omitted was that this short report would mark the beginning of one of the most unsettling cases in Ozark history, a case that would stay largely unrecorded for many decades. The Whitlock property occupied roughly 40 acres of rugged hillside in the vicinity of the small community of Walnut Shade, situated about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Taney County seat. The homestead featured a 2-story timber frame dwelling, a modest barn, and a few outbuildings. According to county documents from 1908, Thomas Whitlock had acquired the land after relocating from Springfield, where he'd been employed as a clerk at Heer's department store. Thomas was characterized in these documents as a man of quiet temperament and methodical habits. His wife Eliza, formerly Eliza Crawford, had taught school in Christian County prior to their union in 1905. The couple had 2 offspring, Edward, who was 6 years old in 1912, and Mary, who was 4. Neighbors later remembered the Whitlocks as a reserved family who seldom took part in community activities. Thomas would occasionally journey into Forsyth or Branson for provisions, but Eliza was rarely observed beyond their property lines after their initial year of residence. Such isolation wasn't unusual for the region, where homesteads could lie miles apart, divided by dense thickets of oak and pine, limestone cliffs, and steep ravines. The Ozarks had long served as a destination for those seeking to vanish, whether from legal troubles, financial obligations, or society at large. According to Joseph Miller, whose family owned the adjacent property to the east, the Whitlocks appeared content enough during their first years on the land. Miller, who was interviewed in 1952 by a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society, recalled that Thomas was meticulous about his property boundaries and largely kept to himself, though he would acknowledge a greeting when our paths happened to cross. The missus was even more withdrawn, but the youngsters seemed healthy and adequately dressed. Miller observed that during the autumn of 1911, roughly 6 months before Eliza's disappearance, Thomas commenced making enhancements to the property, which included excavating what seemed to be a new root cellar behind the residence and strengthening the doors with extra locks. The final confirmed sighting of Eliza Whitlock by anyone outside her immediate family occurred in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, visited the homestead after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. In a statement provided to the Taney County Sheriff in April 1912, Bowman reported finding Eliza looking pale and distant with an anxious demeanor, though she displayed no obvious physical illness. According to Bowman, the house felt unusually chilly, despite a fire burning in the fireplace. And Thomas remained present throughout her visit, responding to most questions directed at his wife. When Bowman proposed that Eliza might gain from a consultation with the doctor in Forsyth, Thomas reportedly replied that such an expense was beyond their means, and that his wife would improve with rest. County documents indicate that Thomas Whitlock had been regularly withdrawing funds from the family's modest savings account at the Taney County Bank throughout the autumn of 1911. According to bank ledgers preserved in the county archives, Thomas took out nearly half the family's savings between September and December of that year. The bank manager, Harold Winters, later recalled that Thomas had justified these withdrawals as necessary for home improvements and winter preparations. Winters noted that such spending wasn't unusual for homesteaders getting ready for an Ozark winter, though the amount seemed excessive for a household of the Whitlock's means. The winter spanning 1911 to 1912 proved exceptionally severe in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall during December and January cut off numerous remote homesteads for weeks at a time, and it wasn't uncommon for families to have no outside contact until early spring. Based on weather records kept by the Springfield Weather Bureau, temperatures during February 1912 fell to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit on several occasions, and several inches of snow lingered on the ground until mid-March. The seclusion imposed by these weather patterns meant that unusual activities could escape neighbors' notice for lengthy stretches. It was during this period of isolation, sometime between late February and early March 1912, that Eliza Whitlock supposedly departed from her family. The precise date of her disappearance was never firmly determined. Thomas Whitlock first mentioned his wife's absence to Joseph Miller in late March, when Miller encountered him on the road to Forsyth. According to Miller's 1952 account, Thomas stated simply that the missus had gone away and provided no additional details. Miller, being accustomed to his neighbor's reserved nature, didn't press for more information. Archival documents from the general store in Forsyth reveal that Thomas Whitlock's buying habits shifted notably in early March 1912. Store ledgers indicate that on March 4th, he purchased an exceptionally large quantity of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil, enough to sustain a household for several weeks without needing another trip to town. The store proprietor, Jeremiah Collins, noted in his personal journal, which was discovered among his papers after his death in 1938, that Thomas seemed agitated and disinclined to engage in typical small talk during this visit. Collins wrote that he asked after Mrs. Whitlock's well-being, to which Thomas responded tersely that she wasn't his concern at present. The matter might have stayed entirely private, if not for the involvement of Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, a Springfield resident who hadn't heard from Eliza since the previous autumn. According to correspondence preserved in the Taney County Historical Society archives, Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade in early April 1912, inquiring about her sister's welfare. When the postmaster informed her that Eliza had reportedly abandoned her family, Catherine traveled to Taney County and requested that Sheriff James Harmon look into the disappearance. Catherine Crawford's personal journal, which her granddaughter donated to the Missouri State Archives in 1961, offers insight into her worries about her sister's circumstances. In an entry from April 10, 1912, Catherine wrote, "I cannot bring myself to believe that Eliza would willingly leave her children." Following her marriage to Thomas, her letters grew increasingly scarce and cautious. Yet her devotion to Edward and Mary shone through in every word she wrote about them. "Something is terribly wrong, and I dread what I might uncover in Taney County." Sheriff Harmon's official report from April 18, 1912 documents his visit to the Whitlock homestead. Harmon reported finding the property in satisfactory condition with Thomas and both children present. The youngsters appeared adequately fed and dressed, though Harmon noted that both remained unusually quiet during his visit. Thomas maintained that Eliza had departed voluntarily after expressing unhappiness with their secluded existence, taking only a small bag containing personal belongings. He claimed ignorance of her destination, but suggested she might have returned to her family in Springfield. Despite Catherine's insistence that her sister hadn't reached out to any relatives, Harmon's report includes a brief description of his inspection of the dwelling, which uncovered no indications of disturbance or struggle. He observed that Eliza's clothing and personal items seemed to be absent from the bedroom drawers, supporting Thomas's assertion that she had packed before leaving. The sheriff concluded that insufficient evidence of foul play existed, and that, as an adult, Eliza possessed the right to abandon her family if she so chose. With Catherine Crawford's reluctant acceptance of this determination, the formal investigation concluded. What Harmon's report omitted, but what emerged from his personal papers, discovered after his death in 1931, was that he had noticed several troubling details during his visit to the Whitlock property. In a private notebook kept separate from his official records, Harmon wrote, "Whitlock appeared too composed for someone recently deserted." The youngsters studied their father's face before responding to any inquiry, no matter how harmless. The boy started to mention his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most unsettling was the recently disturbed ground behind the dwelling, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot. Though it was an odd time for planting and resembled a trench more than a garden bed, Harmon's private notation suggests he harbored suspicions regarding Thomas Whitlock, but lacked adequate evidence to pursue them further. The sheriff wrote, "Without a body or a witness, there exists no crime to investigate." Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, don't amount to proof. In these hills, family affairs are typically regarded as private, and the county lacks resources for prolonged investigations, grounded in mere suspicion. This unwillingness to intervene without concrete proof mirrored the limited law enforcement capabilities and cultural attitudes prevalent in rural Missouri during the early 20th century. Catherine Crawford returned to Springfield following her meeting with Sheriff Harmon. Yet her worries about her sister's fate persisted. According to her journal, she tried to maintain contact with her niece and nephew by dispatching letters and small presents, but received only brief, formal acknowledgments from Thomas in return. In June 1912, she journeyed once more to Taney County, hoping to see the children, but Thomas turned her away, informing her that her presence disrupted the household routine. Catherine's final journal entry concerning the matter, from July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I've failed Eliza. Lacking proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or remove the children. I can only hope that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she'll find her way back to them. Or at least to me." For several years, Eliza Whitlock's disappearance remained a private matter known only to her immediate family and a handful of locals. Thomas continued operating the homestead, raising his children with occasional help from a local woman named Martha Jenkins, who came to assist with household tasks several times weekly. Jenkins, who started working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later told a neighbor that Thomas had instructed her never to discuss Eliza with the children, and to tell them, should they ask, that their mother would return when she got better. Jenkins was briefly interviewed by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 investigation. By then, an elderly woman residing in a Branson nursing home, she recalled several peculiar aspects of her employment at the Whitlock home, according to the interview transcript preserved in the county archives. Jenkins stated that Thomas had established strict rules concerning certain areas of the property that were to be avoided. He wouldn't permit anyone near the root cellar he'd constructed, she said. Once when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so forcefully that she cried out. He later apologized, explaining that dangerous tools were stored there that might injure the children. Jenkins also reported that Thomas frequently struggled with insomnia and would pace the house during the night. On several occasions, she arrived in the morning to find him seated at the kitchen table, apparently having remained awake all night, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Jenkins admitted that she found these behaviors concerning, but attributed them to the strain of raising 2 children alone. Like many in the community, she hesitated to interfere in what she considered private family matters. Edward and Mary Whitlock began attending the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade in 1913. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, noted in her personal diary that both children were unusually withdrawn and that Edward particularly exhibited a worrying tendency toward extended silences. Thornton recorded an incident in October 1913 when a female visitor to the school attempted to engage Mary in conversation about her mother. According to Thornton, Mary became visibly distressed, and later that day, Thomas Whitlock arrived at the school, removed both children, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, which remained in private hands until being donated to the Taney County Historical Society in 1965, contains several other observations about the Whitlock children. She noted that Edward often arrived at school with dark circles under his eyes, explaining that the noises kept him awake at night. When asked what noises he meant, the boy declined to elaborate. Mary, though younger, seemed to adjust better to school life, but displayed what Thornton described as an unusual preoccupation with burial. The teacher recorded finding a series of drawings in Mary's desk depicting what seemed to be a figure lying underground with flowers growing above. In the spring of 1914, according to Thornton's diary, Edward Whitlock's behavior grew increasingly concerning. He began experiencing what the teacher described as episodes, periods when he would become unresponsive, staring fixedly into space. Following one such episode, during which Edward had whispered repeatedly, "She's still digging," Thornton attempted to discuss the boy's welfare with Thomas. Her diary entry for April 12, 1914 reads, "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He informed me that his son's education was his business, and my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter." The Whitlock family continued their isolated existence until 1917, when Thomas abruptly sold the homestead and relocated with the children to Kansas City. County records indicate that the property was sold to James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, for considerably less than its assessed value. Harker later commented to neighbors that Thomas seemed eager to finalize the sale quickly and had accepted the first offer presented. The Whitlock family's departure coincided with increased scrutiny from local authorities. Records from the Taney County School Board, discovered during the 1952 investigation, revealed that Abigail Thornton had finally reported her concerns about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917. The superintendent had subsequently initiated an inquiry, sending a letter to Thomas requesting a meeting to discuss the children's welfare. According to post office records, this letter was delivered on April 3, 1917. Thomas listed the property for sale the following day and had completed the transaction by month's end. James Harker, who purchased the Whitlock property, made several modifications to the homestead, including demolishing what remained of the root cellar behind the house. In a statement given to investigators in 1952, Harker's son, William, recalled that his father had described the cellar as peculiar, deeper than necessary for storing produce, and divided into sections by interior walls. William Harker stated that his father had found several unusual items during the demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs still entangled in the bristles, buried approximately 2 feet below the cellar floor. According to William, his father had thought little of the discovery at the time, assuming it was merely discarded household debris. The Harker family maintained ownership of the former Whitlock property until 1933, when economic hardship forced them to sell during the Great Depression. The homestead passed through several owners over the next 2 decades, gradually falling into disrepair as the original buildings aged and newer residents focused on other areas of the property. By 1950, the house was largely abandoned, with local teenagers occasionally using it as a meeting place, giving rise to rumors that the property was haunted by a crying woman who could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. For the next several decades, the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance faded from local memory. The family's departure from the area, combined with the disruption of World War I and the subsequent influenza epidemic, pushed the unresolved matter into obscurity. It might have remained there permanently had it not been for a discovery made in 1952, when the former Whitlock property, by then abandoned and overgrown, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis planning to establish a hunting lodge, according to a report filed with the Taney County Sheriff's Department on June 12, 1952. The Simmons were clearing brush behind the deteriorating house when they uncovered what appeared to be the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage space. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 of the limestone blocks that had formed the cellar's foundation. The book, severely damaged by moisture and time, was identified as a personal diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock, with entries dating from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who made the initial discovery of the diary, later recalled her first impression of the book in an interview with the Springfield News Leader. The pages were stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me immediately was the change in the writer's penmanship over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, while the later ones became increasingly erratic, as if written by someone in a state of agitation or fear. The discovery of the diary prompted a renewed investigation by Sheriff William Masterson. The contents of the diary, partially legible despite the damage, revealed a disturbing account of the final years of Eliza Whitlock's life. The entries, initially documenting mundane aspects of rural life, gradually shifted to express Eliza's increasing anxiety about her husband's behavior. In an entry dated August 14, 1911, she wrote, "He watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough. Speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another entry dated October 3, 1911 stated, "The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now. He has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. Says it is to keep out the cold. But the first frost has not even come." The diary's most concerning entries began in November 1911, coinciding with Harriet Bowman's visit. Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there listening to every word. When she left, T said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. T works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb." A particularly disturbing entry dated January 8, 1912 reads, "I found Edward this morning standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'A father says we'll all sleep there soon, when the time comes.' When I questioned T about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day. As January progressed, Eliza's entries became shorter and more fragmented. On January 23rd, she wrote, "Tea makes me drink a tonic each evening. It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." Another entry dated February 2nd simply states, "I must get the children away from here. But how? The snow is deep and we are miles from town. T has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth." The final readable entry dated February 17, 1912, contained just 3 lines. "A found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Based on the diary's contents, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the area where the root cellar had been located. On June 18, 1952, investigators uncovered human remains, later identified through dental records as those of Eliza Whitlock. Medical examination determined that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull prior to burial. The position of the remains suggested she had been placed face down in a shallow grave with her hands bound behind her back with wire. Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Eliza's remains, noted several additional details in his report. Wilson determined that Eliza had been approximately 32 years old at the time of death, consistent with her known age. He also found evidence of a previous fracture to her left wrist that had healed sometime before her death, an injury not mentioned in any known records. Most significantly, Wilson identified traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue samples, suggesting that Eliza may have been drugged prior to her death. This finding corroborated her diary entries about the tonic Thomas had insisted she consume. Following the discovery, authorities attempted to locate Thomas Whitlock and his children, but the investigation revealed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from complications related to pneumonia. Edward Whitlock had been killed in action during World War II in 1944. Only Mary Whitlock, by then Mary Coleman, was still living, residing in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 children. Records from the Kansas City Public Library examined during the investigation provided some information about the Whitlock family's life after leaving Taney County. City directories showed that Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 until 1928 when health problems forced him to retire. Edward had attended school through the 8th grade before taking a job at the same warehouse. Neighbors from that period tracked down by investigators described Thomas as a strict father who kept to himself, but was not notably unusual in his behavior. One former neighbor, Estelle Parker, recalled that Thomas never spoke of his late wife and became agitated if anyone inquired about the children's mother. Mary Whitlock had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and moved to Omaha shortly thereafter. According to marriage records, she had listed her mother as deceased on the application, though no death certificate for Eliza existed at that time. This suggested that either Thomas had told his daughter that her mother had died or Mary herself had chosen to represent her absent mother this way. When contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding her mother's disappearance. She stated that her father had always told her that her mother had abandoned the family, and she had no reason to question this account. However, Coleman's husband later contacted investigators privately, reporting that his wife suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards and had always exhibited an extreme fear of enclosed spaces. Richard Coleman provided investigators with additional information about his wife's psychological state. In a letter preserved in the case file, he wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject." The investigation revealed additional details through interviews with former residents of Taney County who had known the Whitlock family. Clara Jensen, who had been a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, recalled that her father had once encountered Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth, purchasing an unusual amount of quicklime from the hardware store. When questioned about the purchase, Thomas had explained it was for preserving the root cellar walls against moisture. Jensen also remembered hearing her parents discuss strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitlock property. Late at night during that winter, sounds her father had attributed to wild animals or the wind in the hollow. Jensen's brother, Harold, provided a written statement describing an encounter he had with Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912. According to this statement, Harold had encountered Edward near the property line separating their family's lands. The Whitlock boy had appeared distressed and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward had replied, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could inquire further, Thomas Whitlock had appeared, calling his son home. Harold had mentioned the strange conversation to his parents, but they had dismissed it as childish imagination. Further research into Thomas Whitlock's background uncovered a possible explanation for his increasingly paranoid behavior in the months preceding Eliza's disappearance. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now known as the Nevada State Hospital, revealed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed to the institution in 1890 after exhibiting violent paranoid delusions. The elder, Whitlock, had reportedly become convinced that his wife was conspiring against him with neighbors and had attempted to imprison her in their home. Hospital records indicated that William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902, with notes describing a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation. The asylum records also contained a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, written to the hospital director in 1895. In this letter, she expressed concern about her son's nervous disposition and inquired whether her husband's condition might be passed to their children. The director's response, also preserved in the file, assured Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited, but advised that Thomas should be guided toward occupations that avoid excessive stress or isolation, suggesting that some familial predisposition toward mental illness was recognized even then. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian researching Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the former Whitlock property at the invitation of the new owners. Matthews documented the layout of the homestead and the location where Eliza's remains had been found. His notes, preserved in the university archives, describe the isolated nature of the property. The homestead sits in a narrow valley, surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at midday, parts of the yard remain in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house, though less than a mile away as the crow flies, is invisible from the Whitlock property due to the intervening terrain. A person could scream here without being heard beyond these hills. Matthews also recorded local beliefs that had developed around the property in the years following the Whitlock's departure. Several residents of Walnut Shade reported avoiding the area, claiming that travelers passing the abandoned homestead at night sometimes heard a woman weeping or the sound of digging. Matthews noted that such stories were typical of many abandoned properties in the Ozarks, but suggested that in this case they might have originated from actual sounds heard by passersby during the winter of 1911 to 1912. In his field journal, Matthews wrote, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain." The case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed in December 1952 with her death ruled a homicide attributed to Thomas Whitlock. Her remains were interred in the Springfield Cemetery, where her parents and sister were buried. The story received brief attention in regional newspapers, but was quickly overshadowed by larger national events. The Taney County Historical Society maintains a small file on the case, including copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings related to the 1952 discovery. Among these materials is a transcript of an interview conducted with Richard Anderson, who had been a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912. Anderson, in his late 70s at the time of the 1952 investigation, recalled that Sheriff Harmon had remained troubled by the Whitlock case long after the official investigation ended. According to Anderson, Harmon had mentioned the case on several occasions over the years, once remarking that sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait. Anderson believed that Harmon had suspected foul play but lacked the evidence and resources to pursue the case further. In 1968, the last significant development in the Whitlock case occurred when Mary Coleman's oldest son, Robert, contacted the Taney County Historical Society requesting information about his grandparents. According to correspondence in the Society's archives, Robert had recently discovered his mother's collection of childhood drawings hidden in their attic after her death from cancer earlier that year. The drawings, created when Mary was between 5 and 8 years old, depicted a recurring scene: a small female figure beneath what appeared to be floorboards or ground, with stick figures standing above. One drawing labeled in a child's handwriting with the words, "Mama sleeping," showed a similar scene with what appeared to be a man digging. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who examined the drawings at the request of the Historical Society, provided a written analysis that is included in the case file. Mitchell noted that the drawings displayed several characteristics typical of children who have experienced trauma, including repetition of disturbing themes, use of heavy pressure when drawing certain elements, particularly the lines representing the ground or floor, and the placement of figures in constrained or buried positions. Mitchell concluded, "These drawings strongly suggest that the child who created them witnessed or was aware of a deeply disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, presumably her mother. The consistency of the imagery across multiple drawings indicates that this was not a momentary fantasy, but a persistent memory or preoccupation." Robert Coleman visited the former Whitlock property in the summer of 1968, by which time the original house had been demolished and replaced with a hunting lodge. In a letter to the Historical Society, following his visit, he wrote, "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sense of sorrow, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this buried truth her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried. Coleman went on to describe his mother as a loving parent, but always somehow distant, as if part of her remained locked in that valley in the Ozarks. He revealed that Mary had refused to discuss her childhood and had reacted with unusual anxiety when her children asked about their maternal grandparents. "Now I understand why," Coleman wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not fully face, that her father, the man who raised her, had murdered her mother and forced her to become complicit in a lifetime of silence." The Whitlock case exemplifies a phenomenon that criminologists would later identify in numerous rural communities: the way in which isolation and privacy can enable domestic violence to escalate without intervention. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where homesteads were separated by difficult terrain and cultural norms discouraged interference in family matters, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few options for escape once her husband's mental state deteriorated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and winter weather made travel nearly impossible. Even when concerns were raised, as by the midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton, the limited resources and jurisdiction of local authorities meant that effective intervention was unlikely. Professor Matthews, in a paper published in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, used the Whitlock case to illustrate broader patterns in rural crime and community response. He noted that Thomas Whitlock's status as the male head of household granted him nearly absolute authority over his family in the eyes of the community. Neighbors who might have noticed warning signs were reluctant to intervene. Adhering to the principle that a man's home is his castle, Matthews argued that this combination of physical isolation and cultural insulation created conditions in which family violence could occur with minimal risk of discovery or consequence. The psychological impact on the Whitlock children represents another dimension of the case that has drawn scholarly attention. Dr. Mitchell, in her analysis of Mary's drawings, suggested that the young girl had developed a complex coping mechanism to deal with the trauma she had witnessed. Rather than facing the unbearable reality of her father's actions, Mitchell wrote, "Mary appears to have compartmentalized the experience, creating a psychological barrier between her conscious awareness and the truth she knew at some level." This fragmentation of memory is a known response to childhood trauma, allowing the individual to function, but at the cost of complete psychological integration. Today, the former Whitlock property is part of a larger recreational area. Few visitors know the history of that particular piece of land or the tragic events that occurred there. The limestone bluffs still cast long shadows across the valley, and at dusk, when the wind moves through the hollow, some say it carries echoes of the past. Sounds that might be mistaken for a woman's distant voice calling from somewhere beneath the ground. What makes the case of Eliza Whitlock particularly disturbing is not just the manner of her death, but the silent complicity that allowed her disappearance to go uninvestigated for so long. In the isolated communities of the early 20th century Ozarks, privacy was highly valued and interfering in family matters was generally avoided. This cultural tendency toward non-intervention created an environment where someone could effectively vanish with minimal questioning. The diary found in 1952 provides our only window into Eliza's experience during those final months. Her growing fear as her husband's mental state deteriorated, her concern for her children's safety, and her increasing isolation from the outside world. The entries suggest a woman who recognized her danger, but found herself trapped by both physical circumstances and social conventions that offered little protection to wives and mothers. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of silence that continued long after Eliza's death. Her children, particularly Mary, seemed to have buried their memories along with their mother, creating psychological barriers that protected them from confronting the truth. When Mary's drawings were discovered after her death, they revealed that some part of her had always known what happened, that the truth had found expression in her art, even as it remained unspoken in her life. Local historian Margaret Branson, who has studied the Whitlock case extensively, observed in a 2012 article marking the centennial of Eliza's disappearance. What happened in that isolated valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband, but the murder of truth itself. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the ground behind their home, and then in a narrative that erased her existence and replaced it with abandonment. The children, too young to fully understand, but old enough to know something was terribly wrong, were forced to participate in this fiction, carrying the weight of an unacknowledged truth throughout their lives. The case reminds us that the most profound horrors often occur not in dramatic moments of violence, but in the slow erosion of safety, in the gradual transformation of home into prison, and in the terrible silence that can descend when those who should protect us become our greatest threat. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. For those who study such cases, the Whitlock tragedy exemplifies how isolation can magnify mental illness, how cultural norms can enable abuse, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. In the decades since Eliza's remains were discovered, forensic psychology has developed tools that might have identified Thomas Whitlock's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence, and laws have changed to offer greater protection to potential victims. Yet, similar stories continue to unfold in isolated places, where privacy can still serve as a shield for the unthinkable. The limestone soil of the Ozarks eventually revealed what Thomas Whitlock tried to hide. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate unknown to all but the man who put her there and perhaps the children who carried the burden of that knowledge in their nightmares and their silence. In that silence lies the true horror of the Whitlock case, a silence that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case records in 1980 for an article in the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, proposed that Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from what would now be classified as paranoid schizophrenia, similar to his father's condition. Hirsch noted that the onset of Thomas's symptoms appeared to follow the classic pattern of the disorder, with initial manifestations in his late 20s or early 30s gradually increasing in severity. The progressive nature of his paranoia, beginning with general suspicion of neighbors, escalating to fears about the security of his home, and culminating in the belief that his wife was somehow contaminated or dangerous, aligns with documented patterns of untreated psychosis. What distinguishes the Whitlock case from many similar tragedies, Hirsch argued, was the extended period during which Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy after eliminating the perceived threat. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or immediate apprehension. Hirsch wrote, Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative, that his wife had abandoned the family, and to function in society for nearly 2 decades afterward suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and create a plausible cover story, indicating that some part of him recognized that what he had done would be condemned by others. The children's response to the trauma they witnessed or intuited has been of particular interest to psychologists studying the case. Edward Whitlock's school records, recovered during the 1952 investigation, show a pattern of declining academic performance and increasing behavioral problems following his mother's disappearance. His teacher noted instances of what would now be recognized as dissociative episodes, periods when he became unresponsive or appeared to be listening to sounds others could not hear. These symptoms suggest that Edward may have developed what modern clinicians would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's response differed from her brother's in significant ways. While Edward exhibited more obvious signs of distress, Mary appeared to adapt more readily to their changed circumstances. Dr. Mitchell suggested that Mary's younger age at the time of the trauma might have made it easier for her to compartmentalize her experiences. Children of 3 to 4 years old are still developing their understanding of permanence and causality. Mitchell wrote in her analysis, Mary may have been better able to accept the narrative her father presented because her cognitive framework was still forming. However, as her drawings reveal, the truth remained present in her unconscious mind, emerging through her artwork in ways she could not verbally express. The long-term impact of childhood trauma is further evidenced by Mary's adult life. According to her husband's statements to investigators, she exhibited several characteristics common to adult survivors of childhood trauma: chronic anxiety, specific phobias related to the traumatic event, particularly her fear of enclosed spaces and an aversion to digging sounds, and emotional detachment. Richard Coleman described his wife as loving but somehow absent, as if a part of her remained elsewhere. This splitting of consciousness, the ability to function normally in most aspects of life while walling off traumatic memories, is a recognized survival mechanism in trauma psychology. The intergenerational effects of the trauma are suggested by Robert Coleman's description of his mother's parenting style. In his correspondence with the Historical Society, he noted that Mary was intensely protective of her children to the point of causing conflict with his father. She would become irrationally anxious if we were out of her sight for even short periods, he wrote. And she had strict rules about certain activities. We were never allowed to play in the basement, for instance, or to dig holes in the yard beyond a certain depth. At the time, these seemed like arbitrary restrictions, but now I understand they were connected to her own buried experiences. The community's response to the Whitlock case reflects broader social patterns regarding family violence and mental illness in early 20th century rural America. When Sheriff Harmon investigated Eliza's disappearance in 1912, he was operating within a legal and cultural framework that placed high value on family privacy and male authority. Domestic violence was widely considered a private matter rather than a crime requiring public intervention. Without clear evidence of foul play, and with Thomas presenting a plausible explanation for his wife's absence, Harmon had limited grounds for pursuing the investigation further, regardless of his personal suspicions. Similarly, the neighbors who noticed concerning changes in Thomas's behavior, his increasing isolation, the unusual modifications to his property, his agitated manner in town, interpreted these signs through the lens of their time. Mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized, often attributed to moral weakness or spiritual failings rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. The withdrawal of a family from community life might raise eyebrows, but was not seen as justification for intervention, particularly in the Ozarks, where independence and self-sufficiency were cultural values. Even those closest to the situation, like Catherine Crawford, faced significant barriers to effective action. As Eliza's sister, Catherine had no legal standing to demand access to her niece and nephew, or to compel a more thorough investigation of her sister's disappearance. In her journal, she expressed frustration with the limitations of her position. If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would take greater interest. But a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is considered her right, regardless of how uncharacteristic such an action would be. Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who included the Whitlock case in her 1980 study of rural homicide patterns, noted that the isolated nature of Ozark communities created perfect conditions for what she termed invisible crimes. Acts of violence that remain undiscovered due to geographic isolation and cultural factors. In urban settings, Foster wrote, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in regions like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with minimal social disruption, particularly women whose social identities were often defined primarily through their husbands. Foster argued that the 40-year delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not merely a failure of investigation, but a systemic blindness to certain forms of violence. The story Thomas Whitlock created, that his wife had abandoned her family, was readily accepted because it aligned with existing narratives about women's unreliability and the difficulties of frontier life. She wrote, the alternative explanation, that a husband had murdered his wife, was both more disturbing and more difficult to address within the available legal and social frameworks. It was simpler for all concerned to accept the abandonment narrative. The physical environment of the Ozarks played a crucial role in facilitating both the crime and its concealment. The rugged terrain, with its deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves, has long provided hiding places for those seeking to escape notice. During Prohibition, these same features made the region ideal for moonshining operations. In the Whitlock case, the isolated location of the homestead, positioned in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hillsides, ensured that unusual activities would go unobserved. The harsh winter of 1911 to 1912, with its heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, further reduced the likelihood of unexpected visitors who might have witnessed concerning behavior. Professor Matthews, in his study of the property, noted that the limestone, rich soil of the region had inadvertently preserved evidence that might have otherwise disappeared. The alkaline composition of the soil, combined with the relatively dry conditions inside the collapsed root cellar, created conditions that preserved both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains. He wrote, in more acidic soils, or in locations with greater moisture, decomposition would have been more complete, potentially eliminating the possibility of identification decades later. This preservation of evidence allowed the truth to eventually emerge, bringing a measure of resolution to a case that might otherwise have remained an unsolved disappearance. When Walter and Ruth Simmons discovered Eliza's diary in 1952, they provided the catalyst for an investigation that finally revealed what had happened on that isolated homestead 40 years earlier.